Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest, longest, and most exhausting disasters in European history. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and let's slowly wander into a world where kings made terrible decisions. Nobles argued over things that somehow became everybody's problem, and entire generations were born, lived, and died while a war just kept sitting there in the background like the world's most unwanted house guest. Tonight we're talking about the 30 Years' War, a conflict so complicated that historians still argue about how exactly to explain it without making everyone's eyes glaze over. Which is funny because the war itself was basically Europe's longest group project where nobody agreed on the assignment. Everyone blamed everyone else, and somehow the project lasted 3 decades. It began in 1618 and ended in 1648. 30 years. That is not just a war. That is a lifestyle choice. Imagine being born at the start of it. Your parents tell you, "Don't worry, this will probably be over soon." And then you are 40 years old. You have children. Your children ask, "Was there ever a time when Europe wasn't fighting?" And you have to sit there quietly because, honestly, you barely remember. But the funny thing about the 30 Years' War is that it did not begin as some giant continent-wide disaster. Of course not. History loves starting with something small and awkward before turning into an enormous tragedy. The war began in the Holy Roman Empire, which despite the impressive name was neither particularly holy nor Roman, nor really an empire in the way most people imagine. It was more like a giant collection of hundreds of little states, kingdoms, duchies, and territories all loosely connected under one emperor. Basically, medieval Europe looked at the idea of a simple government and said, "No thanks, let's make this much more complicated." The emperor technically ruled the empire, but many local rulers had a lot of independence. And naturally, when you have hundreds of powerful people with their own armies, their own money, and their own opinions, things are going to become peaceful and reasonable. Obviously, the main problem was religion. Because Europe had spent the previous century arguing about Christianity in ways that were somehow both extremely serious and incredibly messy. The Protestant Reformation had changed everything. Back in 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther criticized the Catholic Church and started a movement that spread across Europe. Suddenly, Christianity was no longer one single united system. There were Catholics, there were Lutherans, there were Calvinists, and everyone believed they were correct. Because apparently humans have always been very talented at turning theological disagreements into political disasters. For a while, the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire tried to keep things balanced. The Peace of Augsburg allowed rulers to choose whether their territory would be Catholic or Lutheran. It was basically an agreement saying, "Okay, everyone calm down. Pick a side. Stop fighting." A reasonable idea. Except history has a habit of looking at reasonable ideas and saying, "That's cute." Because the agreement did not include Calvinists. And it did not solve the deeper problem. The empire was becoming divided. Some rulers feared the Catholic emperor was trying to take back control. Catholics feared Protestant rulers were destroying the old order. Everyone was suspicious. Everyone was nervous. And everyone had weapons, which is never a comforting combination. Now, let's meet one of the central characters in this royal mess. Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand was a deeply religious Catholic ruler. Very deeply religious. The kind of person who wakes up and thinks, "How can I make today more Catholic?" He was educated by Jesuits and believed strongly that Protestantism was a dangerous mistake that needed to be corrected. This attitude was not exactly helpful for a peaceful empire. But Ferdinand was also a product of his time. In his world, religion was not just a personal belief. Religion was politics. Religion was identity. Religion was power. A ruler changing religion could affect taxes, alliances, laws, and who controlled important positions. So when Ferdinand became ruler of Bohemia, many people became worried. Bohemia was a wealthy region with a large Protestant population, and Ferdinand wanted to strengthen Catholic influence. The Protestants of Bohemia looked at this and thought, this seems like the beginning of a problem. And they were correct, because in 1618, something happened that has become one of the most famous strange moments in European history. The defenestration of Prague. A word that sounds like a fancy furniture accident. But defenestration simply means throwing someone out of a window, which is exactly what happened. A group of Protestant nobles in Prague became angry with representatives of the Catholic government. The argument became heated, and eventually, the nobles grabbed several officials and threw them out of a castle window. Because apparently in 17th century Europe, sometimes the official solution to political disagreement was just, please exit through the window. The strange thing is that the people thrown out survived. They fell from a high window but landed in a pile of something soft. Some sources say manure. Others debate the details. Either way, they lived, which probably made the whole situation even more awkward. Imagine surviving being thrown from a window and then realizing, oh no, now I have to continue this political crisis. And continue it they did. The rebellion spread. The Protestant nobles rejected Ferdinand and chose their own king. They selected Frederick V, Elector Palatine. Frederick was young, ambitious, and probably underestimated the situation. He accepted the crown of Bohemia, which was a little like accepting a free vacation without checking the location. The location was disaster. Frederick was known as the Winter King because his reign lasted only one winter. A very short royal career. The kind of job where your resume says, King. And then immediately, actually never mind. Ferdinand responded by sending armies against him. The rebellion was crushed at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. Frederick lost his throne. The Habsburgs regained control. And for a moment, it looked like the crisis might be over. But Europe had already stepped onto the slippery slope. Because other powers were watching, and they had their own interests. The war slowly transformed from a religious conflict into something much bigger. This is where history gets interesting in the most exhausting possible way. Because the 30 Years' War was not simply Catholics fighting Protestants. That would be too simple. Instead, Catholic France would later fight against Catholic Habsburg Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Because when politics enters the room, everyone suddenly discovers that yesterday's enemy can become today's useful friend. Countries were not just fighting for religion. They were fighting for influence. Land, trade, power, the usual human collection of reasons. Meanwhile, ordinary people were stuck in the middle. Farmers, townspeople, families who had absolutely nothing to do with royal arguments. They watched armies move through their lands. They watched taxes rise. They watched soldiers demand supplies. And they probably wondered why a disagreement between powerful men always somehow ended with everyone else suffering. A very familiar historical pattern. The war continued, and Europe slowly moved into one of the darkest periods of the 17th century. But before we float into the next part of this enormous royal disaster, let's appreciate something. The 30 Years' War was created by people who believed they were defending order. Everyone thought they were protecting something important: their faith, their country, their traditions, their power. And yet the result was decades of chaos, which is probably one of history's favorite jokes. People try desperately to control the future, and the future usually responds by making everything much messier. So now, with the first pieces of this enormous puzzle in place, we'll slowly move forward into the years when the war grew beyond anyone's control. Because next, we meet the generals, kings, and exhausted populations who discovered that ending a war is often much harder than starting one. And in Europe during the 17th century, starting things was apparently the easy part. Hey guys, welcome back. Get comfortable, because tonight we continue drifting through the 30 Years' War, a conflict that somehow managed to become longer than many people's entire lifetimes. And honestly, that is the strangest part about old wars. We often imagine them as these huge historical events with dramatic battles, famous commanders, and grand speeches. But for the average person living through it, it was mostly waiting. Waiting for soldiers to leave. Waiting for harvests to survive. Waiting for taxes to stop increasing. Waiting for powerful people who lived in fancy castles to finish arguing about things that ordinary people had very little control over. A very old tradition. The wealthy make decisions. Everyone else gets the consequences. Now, after the initial Bohemian Rebellion was crushed, many people might have assumed the conflict was finished. But the problem with European politics in the 17th century was that nobody ever really left a problem alone. There was always another ruler, another alliance, another person who thought, you know what this situation needs? More involvement. Because apparently the one thing Europe needed after a rebellion was more people joining the argument. So, let's meet one of the most important figures of the early war. Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein was not a king. He was not even born into the highest level of nobility. But he was extremely ambitious. The kind of ambitious person who looked at a chaotic continent and thought, this seems like a wonderful career opportunity. And strangely enough, it was. Wallenstein became one of the most powerful military leaders in Europe. He created a massive army for the Habsburg Emperor and became incredibly wealthy. He owned enormous estates. He collected titles. He basically built himself into a one-man political machine. Of course, this made other nobles uncomfortable, because nothing makes aristocrats nervous quite like another aristocrat becoming too successful. Everyone loves power, but they prefer when other people have less of it. Wallenstein was an unusual character. He was intelligent. He was organized. He was practical. But he was also mysterious and disliked by many people around him. He believed war could be managed like a business, which, unfortunately for everyone involved, was exactly the kind of thinking that kept the war going. Armies needed money. Money required resources. Resources came from the land. And the land belonged to people who were already struggling. Soldiers had to eat. Horses had to eat. Weapons had to be supplied. And governments often could not pay for everything. So armies took what they needed. This was called living off the land. A phrase that sounds peaceful, almost like gardening. But it usually meant soldiers showing up and saying, "Nice farm you have here. It would be a shame if our entire army needed dinner." The war became a moving disaster. Armies traveled across German territories. They fought battles. They occupied towns. They demanded supplies. And then another army came later and did the same thing. For civilians, the difference between one side and another often became less important. A soldier was still a soldier. A demand was still a demand. A burned field was still a burned field. Now, while all of this was happening, the war itself began changing. The original religious conflict became a larger European power struggle. And one country in particular decided that this was the perfect moment to become involved.
France.
Which is where things become wonderfully complicated. Because France was a Catholic country. The French king was Catholic. The French population was mostly Catholic. And yet France eventually fought against the Catholic Habsburgs.
Why? Power.
Because the French government looked at the Habsburg family and thought, interesting, they control Spain. They influence the Holy Roman Empire. They surround us. Perhaps we should do something about that. And by do something, they meant join a massive war. The person guiding France during this period was Cardinal Richelieu, a fascinating figure. He was a Catholic churchman who became one of the strongest political leaders in Europe. A cardinal, a government official, a master of strategy. Basically the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone else realize they were probably not the smartest person there. Richelieu understood something important. Countries did not always act based on religion. They acted based on interests. A Catholic France could fight Catholic enemies if it benefited France. And that is exactly what happened. The war was no longer just about who has the correct faith.
It became
who gets to be the strongest power in Europe, which is a much more traditional historical question. Meanwhile, the average person probably looked at all these rulers and thought, could everyone please stop having international strategy meetings with my village as the meeting room? Now, let's move to another important figure, Gustavus Adolphus. The Swedish king entered the war in 1630, and he became one of the most famous military leaders of the conflict. He was known as the Lion of the North, a very dramatic nickname, because historical rulers loved giving themselves animal-related titles. Apparently being compared to a lion made you seem powerful. Nobody wanted to be called Frederick the mildly concerned goat, so lions it was. Gustavus Adolphus was a talented commander. He improved military organization. He used new tactics. He created a more flexible army. And he helped turn Sweden into a major European power. But the thing about history is that even talented leaders cannot escape being human. Gustavus was only 37 when he died at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. A huge loss for Sweden. And another reminder that wars have a habit of removing the people who seem most capable of controlling them. After his death, the war continued. Because wars are surprisingly good at continuing after everyone involved wishes they would stop. By the 1630s, Germany and surrounding regions were exhausted. Cities had suffered. Economies had collapsed. Populations had declined. The war had become less like a clear battle between two sides and more like a giant machine that nobody knew how to turn off. And this is where the 30 Years' War becomes especially tragic, because the original reasons for fighting became less important. Many soldiers fighting in later years were not even connected to the original religious arguments. They were professionals, mercenaries, people whose job was simply war. The conflict had created its own economy. And when war becomes an industry, ending it becomes much harder. Because people have built their lives around the chaos. Of course, that does not mean everyone wanted the war to continue. Most ordinary people wanted peace. Farmers wanted to farm. Merchants wanted to trade. Families wanted stability. Basically, everyone except the people making the biggest decisions wanted the same simple thing. A normal life, which is often the one thing history refuses to provide. As the 1640s arrived, Europe was finally approaching the end of this enormous struggle. But ending a war involving multiple countries, competing interests, and decades of resentment was not going to be simple. Because after 30 years of fighting, everyone had something to lose. And everyone wanted something in return. So next, we drift toward the long and painfully complicated peace negotiations. A moment when Europe finally sat down and tried to answer the question, how do we clean up the enormous mess we created? A question humanity has been asking for centuries. And somehow we're still working on the answer. Hey guys, settle back in. Tonight we continue our slow walk through the 30 Years' War, a conflict that started with arguments about religion and slowly transformed into a giant European struggle over power, influence, and the timeless human tradition of making problems much larger than they originally needed to be. By the 1640s, everyone was tired. Not just a little tired. The kind of tired where even the kings, generals, and diplomats who had spent years insisting they were completely right were beginning to quietly wonder, wait, are we actually accomplishing anything? A rare moment of self-reflection from people who had spent decades sending armies across the countryside. The war had changed Europe, especially the German territories inside the Holy Roman Empire. Villages had been damaged. Trade had suffered. Many communities had lost large parts of their populations. And the political landscape was completely different from what it had been in 1618. The funny thing about long wars is that they often end when everyone involved finally reaches the same conclusion. This is exhausting. Not necessarily because one side has a perfect victory. Not because everyone suddenly becomes friends. Mostly because everyone runs out of energy. And that is exactly where Europe found itself. Now, before we reach the peace agreement, we need to understand one important thing. The 30 Years' War did not end with one dramatic final battle. There was no single moment where everyone dropped their weapons and said, "All right, everyone go home." History is rarely that convenient. Instead, it ended through years of negotiation. And those negotiations happened at the Peace of Westphalia, a name that sounds peaceful, which is fitting, because after 30 years of chaos, Europe was desperately in need of something that sounded calm. The peace talks began in 1644. They took place mainly in the towns of Münster and Osnabrück. And if you imagine hundreds of diplomats arriving, sitting down, and quickly solving everything, you have clearly not met diplomats. Because negotiations were complicated. Very complicated. There were questions about borders. Questions about religion. Questions about political authority. Questions about who deserved compensation. Basically, everyone showed up with a list of complaints. And everyone believed their complaints were the most important. A very human habit. The diplomats spent years discussing details.
Years.
Imagine having a meeting that lasts longer than some modern careers. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to year 3 of discussing paragraph 7. But slowly, agreements were reached. The Peace of Westphalia was finally signed in 1648. It brought the 30 Years' War to an end, and it changed Europe in important ways. One major result was that the Holy Roman Empire became even more decentralized. The local rulers gained more independence. The emperor still existed, but his power was limited. The empire became less like a unified country and more like a huge collection of states that happened to share a name. Basically, the empire was the historical equivalent of a group project where everyone technically belonged to the same team, but nobody wanted the same grade. Another important result was the recognition of more religious diversity. The old system had focused mainly on Catholics and Lutherans. Now Calvinists received official recognition as well. This did not create perfect religious harmony. Of course not. Human beings did not suddenly become peaceful because a treaty was signed, but it created a new political reality. Countries increasingly began thinking of themselves as separate states with their own interests. And this is one reason historians often connect the Peace of Westphalia with the development of the modern state system. The idea that countries have sovereignty, that governments control their own territories, that outside powers should not simply interfere whenever they feel like it. A concept that sounds obvious today, but in 17th century Europe, it was a major shift. Now, let's take a moment to look at the people behind this enormous historical event. Because history often focuses on kings, emperors, and generals. But the 30 Years' War was also about ordinary people who had to survive the decisions of elites. A farmer in a small German village did not wake up one morning thinking, "I hope today's international religious conflict changes the balance of European power."
No.
They probably thought, "Can I get through this year without losing my crops?" A merchant probably cared less about which dynasty controlled the region and more about whether roads were safe enough to move goods. A parent probably cared less about political philosophy and more about whether their children had enough food. These people rarely appear in grand historical paintings. They do not get statues. They do not get dramatic biographies. But they lived through the consequences. And honestly, that is often where history becomes most interesting. Because behind every treaty, every battle, and every royal decision are millions of ordinary lives. Now, after the war ended, Europe looked different. The Habsburgs were weakened. France became one of the strongest powers on the continent. Sweden gained influence. And the idea of religious wars slowly began to decline. Not disappear, just decline. Europe still had plenty of conflicts ahead, because apparently one giant war was not enough. There would be more arguments, more alliances, more rulers convinced that their personal goals were somehow the destiny of the entire world. Because if there is one thing history teaches us, it is that powerful people rarely run out of reasons to compete. But the 30 Years' War remained special, because it was not just a war. It was a turning point. It marked the transition from an older medieval world of dynasties and religious unity into a more modern world of nation-states and international politics. And that is why this war, despite being less famous than many others, matters so much. It quietly shaped the world that came afterward. No giant movie franchises. No famous battlefield quotes. No universally recognized heroic figures. Just 30 years of complicated politics, exhausted populations, and rulers discovering that controlling events is much harder than starting them. A very expensive lesson, paid for mostly by people who never got to choose the lesson. And that brings us to the strange legacy of the 30 Years' War. Because after the fighting stopped, Europe had to live with the consequences. The rulers moved on. The diplomats returned home. The treaties were signed. But the scars remained. So next, we'll slowly drift into the aftermath. The changed Europe. The weakened empires. The rise of new powers. And the quiet way one forgotten war helped create the modern world. Because sometimes the most important moments in history are not the loudest ones. Sometimes they are simply the ones that quietly change everything. Hey guys, welcome back. Get comfortable. The lights are low. The room is quiet. And tonight we continue our slow journey through the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that somehow managed to spend 3 decades turning Europe into a giant political headache. By 1648, the guns were finally quiet. The armies began leaving. The diplomats packed up their papers. The rulers returned to their palaces, and everyone involved tried to convince themselves that the enormous disaster had been worth it, which is something leaders throughout history have always been very good at doing. They can create a problem. They can make the problem bigger. They can make the problem last for decades. And then, once it ends, they can stand there and say, clearly, this was all part of a very important plan. History has many examples of this particular talent, but the reality was much more complicated. Europe after the 30 Years' War was tired, very tired. The Holy Roman Empire especially had been deeply affected. Many regions had suffered years of fighting, economic disruption, and political instability. Some areas recovered quickly. Others took generations. And for ordinary people, peace did not arrive like a magical switch. A treaty could be signed in a fancy room, but rebuilding homes, farms, and communities took much longer. A person who had spent their entire childhood hearing marching armies outside their village did not suddenly wake up the next morning thinking, "Wonderful, peace has arrived. Everything is normal again."
No.
They probably looked around and thought, all right, now how do we rebuild? A very reasonable question. Now, one of the biggest political consequences was the decline of the Habsburg dream. The Habsburg family had spent centuries trying to create a powerful European dynasty. And to be fair, they were extremely successful. They controlled Spain. They controlled Austria. They influenced the Holy Roman Empire. They arranged marriages like they were collecting countries as souvenirs. Because for royal families, marriage was often just diplomacy, wearing fancy clothing. The famous Habsburg strategy was, why fight for land when you can simply marry someone who owns it? A clever idea. Until everyone realized that having too many family connections created its own problems. But after the 30 Years' War, the Habsburgs faced limits. They remained powerful, very powerful, but they could no longer easily dominate Europe. The dream of a united Catholic empire under their control had faded. Meanwhile, France rose, and France was now becoming the major power on the continent. The irony was beautiful. France had spent years fighting the Habsburgs. And the result was exactly what France wanted. A stronger France. A weaker rival. This was the age of French influence. And eventually, France would be shaped by another famous figure, Louis XIV, the Sun King, a ruler who would later become famous for his enormous palace, endless ceremonies, and the belief that monarchy should revolve around him. Literally. The sun was not just a symbol. It was his entire brand. Louis XIV would later say, or at least be associated with saying, I am the state. Whether the exact words are accurate or not, the idea captures the style. A king who believed the monarchy was not just a government. It was a performance, a lifestyle, a very expensive lifestyle. But before Louis XIV became the center of French power, Europe had to adjust to the new balance created after 1648. The idea of state power became more important. Rulers focused more on administration. Standing armies became more common. Governments became more centralized. The world was slowly moving away from medieval-style politics. The old system of feudal relationships was weakening, and stronger states were emerging. Now, let's talk about one of the quieter effects of the war. The decline of the idea that religion alone should decide European politics. Before the 30 Years' War, many conflicts were deeply connected to religious identity. Catholic versus Protestant. Old traditions versus reform movements. But after decades of destruction, rulers became more practical. They still cared about religion. Very much. but they increasingly understood that political survival mattered too. A Catholic country could ally with Protestants. A Protestant country could negotiate with Catholics. Because at the end of the day, rulers wanted power. And power has a funny habit of making people flexible. A principle today, a negotiation tomorrow, a completely different position next year. The royal court was basically a place where everyone carried two things: a title and a carefully prepared excuse. Now, while kings and diplomats were reshaping Europe, the common people were experiencing something much less glamorous: recovery. And recovery was slow. Imagine living through 30 years of instability. A farmer who was young when the war began might now be an older person. Their entire adult life had been shaped by conflict. A whole generation grew up knowing uncertainty as normal. And that is one of the most important things about the 30 Years' War. It was not just about battles. It was about time. 30 years is a long time. A child born in 1618 could be a parent by 1648. Someone could spend their entire youth watching Europe struggle. The war became part of the background of life. Like weather, like seasons, like something everyone hated but nobody could control. And yet somehow societies continued. People married. People worked. People raised children. People rebuilt. Human history is full of these quiet moments. The ability of ordinary people to continue even when the world around them becomes extremely inconvenient. Now, there is another interesting legacy of the 30 Years' War. It changed how Europeans thought about diplomacy. The peace negotiations at Westphalia showed that large international problems could be handled through formal agreements between states. It was not perfect. Nothing involving dozens of governments ever is. But it created a model, a system, a new way of thinking about international relations. The modern world would continue developing this idea. Countries would negotiate. They would form alliances. They would hold conferences. They would create treaties. And sometimes, despite all the paperwork, they would still end up fighting. Because humanity loves both diplomacy and completely ignoring diplomacy. A strange combination. So when people ask why the 30 Years' War matters, the answer is not simply because many people died. Many wars have that terrible distinction. The reason it matters is because it changed the structure of Europe. It helped create the political world that followed. It weakened old powers. It strengthened new ones. It changed the relationship between religion and government. It helped shape the idea of the modern state. And it did all of this without becoming one of the most famous wars in popular memory. No giant Hollywood legends. No universally known heroes. Just a long, complicated, exhausting conflict that quietly rearranged history, which is honestly very fitting, because the 30 Years' War itself was like that. It was not one dramatic moment. It was a slow accumulation of decisions, small arguments, political fears, personal ambitions, and eventually an enormous consequence. A reminder that history is often not changed by one single event. Sometimes history changes because people keep making choices, one after another, until one day everyone looks around and realizes,
Wait,
how did we get here? And that question has followed humanity for centuries. Next, we'll slowly drift even further into the legacy of this forgotten war. The rulers who benefited, the societies that suffered, and why a conflict that began with a window in Prague helped shape the world we live in today. Hey guys, settle in. Tonight we continue our slow journey through the aftermath of the 30 Years' War. A war that began with a few angry nobles a castle window, and a lot of political tension. And somehow, because history enjoys making everything complicated, it became one of the biggest turning points in European history. The strange thing about the 30 Years' War is that it does not have the same cultural reputation as many other conflicts. Ask someone to name famous wars, and you might hear about Napoleonic Wars, the World War I, or the World War II. But the 30 Years' War? Many people respond with, "Wait, what was that again?" Which is unfortunate, because this war quietly shaped the political world that came afterward. It was not famous because of one single heroic figure. It was not remembered because of one dramatic moment. It was remembered because it changed the rules. And sometimes the quiet changes are the ones that last the longest. After 1648, European rulers increasingly began building stronger centralized states. The old medieval world, where power was spread among kings, nobles, churches, and local authorities, was slowly transforming. Kings wanted more control. Governments wanted more organization. Armies became more professional. Taxes became more structured. Basically, rulers looked at the chaos of the previous decades and decided, perhaps we should make the government better at controlling things. A very reasonable conclusion, especially after spending 30 years discovering that chaos is expensive. One place where this change became very clear was France. France had survived the 30 Years' War and emerged stronger. The country had a growing population, a powerful monarchy, and ambitious rulers. Eventually, this led to the rise of Louis XIV. Louis XIV became one of the most famous monarchs in European history, not because he won some single enormous battle, not because he discovered a new continent, but because he mastered the art of being a king. And by art, I mean turning monarchy into a full-time performance. Louis XIV loved ceremony. Every movement of the royal court had meaning. Waking up,
Getting dressed. Eating.
walking. Everything could become a political event. Imagine your morning routine becoming a government ceremony. Someone says, "The king is now putting on his shoes." And everyone around him says, "Excellent." A historic moment. Royal life was truly strange. But Louis understood something important. Power was not only about armies. It was about image,
Control.
symbolism. The king needed people to believe in his greatness. So he built Palace of Versailles into a symbol of absolute monarchy. A massive palace. A place where nobles were drawn into court life. A place where the king could keep an eye on the people who might otherwise challenge him. Because one of the oldest problems for rulers is that powerful nobles are useful. But powerful nobles are also dangerous. They have money. They have influence. They have their own followers. And sometimes they have ideas, which is always inconvenient. Louis XIV solved part of this problem by making the royal court the center of everything. Instead of powerful nobles controlling their own regions, they competed for royal attention. A much safer arrangement for the king. Because a noble fighting for a fancy title at court is usually less dangerous than a noble building an independent power base. Meanwhile, across Europe, other states were also changing. The idea of the modern nation-state was developing. Not instantly, not perfectly, but slowly. Countries began thinking of themselves less as collections of territories owned by dynasties and more as political units with borders and governments. Of course, the old system did not disappear overnight. Royal families still cared deeply about inheritance. Marriage alliances still mattered. And monarchs still spent enormous amounts of energy deciding which relative should control which piece of land. because European royalty had a complicated relationship with the concept of just getting along. Now, let's return for a moment to the Holy Roman Empire. After the war, the emperor's power was limited. The empire continued to exist for another century and a half, but it was not the same. The many states inside it gained more independence. Some became stronger. Some remained small, and the whole structure became increasingly difficult to manage. Imagine trying to run a company where every department has its own laws, its own army, and the ability to ignore the CEO. That was basically the Holy Roman Empire. A very impressive organizational chart. A very difficult workplace. Another important consequence of the war was the decline of Spain. Spain had once been one of the greatest powers in Europe. It had enormous wealth from its overseas empire. It had powerful armies. It had influence everywhere. But the 17th century was a difficult period. The Spanish economy struggled. Military costs became enormous. Rivals grew stronger. And Spain slowly lost its position as the dominant European power. Meanwhile, countries like France, England, and the Dutch Republic became increasingly important. The balance of power was shifting. And this is something historians often return to. The 30 Years' War was not just about destruction. It was about transition. One world ending. Another world beginning. The old medieval order was fading. The modern political system was forming, and ordinary people were caught somewhere between the two. Now, there is something else worth remembering. The 30 Years' War was also a lesson about the limits of power. The rulers involved had enormous authority. They had titles. They had armies. They had wealth. They had advisors. And yet they struggled to control the events they created. A rebellion became a continental war. A religious dispute became a political struggle. A short conflict became 30 years of exhaustion. Because history has a habit of reminding powerful people that control is often an illusion. People make plans. Events respond differently. And sometimes the result is something nobody expected. The war began with people trying to protect their world. By the end, they had created a new one. A world where states mattered more. Where diplomacy became more important. Where religion became less central to international politics. And where Europe entered a new era. A quieter era in some ways, but also an era filled with new rivalries, new ambitions, and new conflicts waiting in the distance. Because history never really ends. It just changes the subject. The 30 Years' War faded into memory. The diplomats returned home. The soldiers disappeared into civilian life. The damaged towns slowly rebuilt. And the next generation inherited a very different Europe. A Europe shaped by exhaustion. A Europe shaped by compromise. A Europe that had learned, painfully, that even the most powerful rulers could create disasters they could not easily escape. And maybe that is the final lesson of this forgotten war. Not that people fought. People have always fought. But that small choices can grow. Small disagreements can expand. And sometimes the events that seem like minor political problems today become the turning points future generations study. A window in Prague. A disagreement among nobles. A struggle over religion. A fight for power. And eventually, the reshaping of an entire continent. Next, we'll slowly look back at the people who lived through this strange era. The kings, the generals, the diplomats, and the ordinary people who carried the weight of decisions made far above them. Because behind every great historical event are millions of quiet stories. And those are usually the ones worth hearing.